And it's recording. Hi,
Great.
everybody. I am Liz Merrill. I am with Open Space Mediation, and I have Jennifer Meyer here, who is a therapist, and she collaborates with me and a couple of other people on our local chapter of Second Saturday. And if you don't know about that, I will put a link in the below comment section so that you can learn about it. It's an educational workshop for women who are going through divorce. They have chapters all over the country. Ours is Northern Colorado, and we have them twice a month, free workshops that cover a wide range of topics related to divorce, in particular to women going through divorce, and it's educational in nature. So it's not really a support group. It's really more for people who just want to have a lot of information. And I love always listening to Jennifer because she has such amazing advice, and I can just feel the compassion coming from her. So I wanted to interview her here about narcissism, because that is a topic that has been on the, it's been a buzzword. It's been on the rise. I noticed that that there are a couple of reports and papers that say it's becoming an epidemic, and it's been steadily increasing in this country in particular since the 80s. And I think there's a lot of confusion about it. So before we get into that, Jennifer, would you please introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your practice?
Yes, absolutely. So thanks for having me, Liz. I appreciate it, and I enjoy working with you as well. And yeah, so my name is Jennifer Meyer. I have a private practice here in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I work a lot with individuals going through divorce, recovering from divorce, and also going through or recovering from different types of abuse, including narcissistic abuse. So it's a topic that I really enjoy helping people with, because it's really hard to tell sometimes if someone's being abused by a narcissist, because it doesn't show up the way physical abuse does always.
Yeah,
So
great. So let me ask you first and foremost, since I think you probably can roll this off the tip of your tongue, what is the definition of a person who has the narcissistic personality disorder? And is that different than somebody who exhibits narcissistic traits?
yes, absolutely. So I think a lot of times these days people get confused by what a narcissist is, because we all at times exhibit, selfish traits or narcissistic traits at times, especially when we're going through difficulties in relationships. But narcissistic personality disorder is different in that it's pervasive. So personality disorders are pervasive patterns of personality that are exhibited over time throughout someone's lifetime. And so it's not just periods of narcissism. It is, every relationship is exploitative in that way. Low empathy to no empathy, an exaggerated sense of grandiosity, fantasy, needing excessive admiration. These are some of the different characteristics listed by the DSM-5, which is the most recent diagnostic and statistic manual for diagnosing different mental disorders. So there's a lot more press about it these days, and I think that's partly why people are more familiar with the term.
Yeah, and so I think you can tell me if I'm right or not, but I think it's actually not that easy to get a diagnosis of a narcissistic personality disorder for I don't know why, but that's what I've read.
Mm-hmm. Well, in my experience as a therapist, it is difficult to get a diagnosis, just because often what I work with is the partners or children of people that would be deemed narcissistic or that would have this disorder. And a lot of times people that would qualify for those diagnostic criteria don't come into therapy often because,
Why
in
should they?
their
Because
mind,
they're fine.
things might be fine from their
Yeah,
perspective, right?
and you can't diagnose somebody just by hearing about their behavior.
Right, that's
Yeah,
true. There are times people might share with me some of the different traits and things that they are experiencing on the other side of that. And that might be something that we talk about as a possibility, but no, I can't diagnose someone that I haven't worked with.
yeah. And so you brought up at the top that you support people who are going through different kinds of abuse. So how is narcissistic abuse different than other types of emotional or mental abuse?
Well,
We'll just leave
so
the physical abuse piece out of it, because I imagine that can show up in all different kinds of ways.
right, it can, but I think there's one thing that's interesting about physical abuse, and that is that it shows up in a way. And I think when it comes to narcissistic abuse, people are often confused because they can't really identify it. They can't
Mhm.
pinpoint what's happening, and nobody else is seeing necessarily the effects of it like we would with physical abuse.
Yeah,
So often victims of narcissistic abuse are really doubting themselves, having a hard time pinpointing what it is. And some of the tactics that are used in these arguments and interactions are really hard to pinpoint. People get flooded and upset and can't really notice what's happening. So
yeah,
they feel confused and upset and traumatized.
yeah. They're just getting really pulled into that kind of storyline that the narcissist is telling them. So, do you have any good sense or fundamental knowledge from studying and reading, what causes a narcissist to be a narcissist, and can they get better, can they be treated, or is it just something that they're born with and they're stuck with because they don't recognize that they have a problem, right? It's always someone else's
Right.
problem. So I mean that in of itself presents a little bit of a catch-22, because it's
Mhm.
hard to get better if you don't think there's anything wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting with narcissistic personality disorder because just in my experience, what happens is, children that are not necessarily getting what they need in terms of ego strength and in a positive sense, uh, sort of become where they need this excessive admiration. And, instead of being able to just have a healthy ego, we need lots and lots to keep that feeling like it's healthy. And so people that are deemed narcissistic come across as having a huge ego, but it's really a very fragile ego that needs a lot of external validation and
Mhm.
admiration. And so it's kind of confusing, but it's really just, if the theory is that if they're not getting what they need, as children in terms of empathy and not entitlement, but empathy and a fair amount of that, then, it kind of turns into this pervasive need to get that met from unhealthy means from other people through
Right.
exploitation.
So, I mean, a lot of someone said this to me a long time ago, and I used to think it was just sounded like BS, but now like the older I get, the more I'm like, yeah, that's kind of true. I mean, everybody growing up has some degree of dysfunction in their childhood, right? Even if you're from the most perfect family, there are problems along the way. And some people spend the rest of their lives trying to sort it out and never do. Some people just have resiliency, I guess, and can. But either way, whatever happens to you in childhood, you spend the rest of your adult life kind of coping with, regardless of what it was. And I imagine that not everybody who experiences um, either abuse from their parents or just not enough empathy and support and validation and love ends up being a narcissist. Do you have any sense of what the difference is between those two types of people, the people who develop a personality disorder and the people who don't?
Hmm. That's a great question. I think a lot of it is in terms of how intense was whether it was, I mean, it could be parents just not being there, being completely unavailable emotionally, physically. It could be so many different things, but severity certainly has a lot to do
Mm,
with it. How long did this happen? What were the other circumstances going on? Was there a parent that was available, that was able to meet some of those needs in a healthy way? Was it two parents? I mean,
mm,
there's so many different things. Sometimes substance abuse can be thrown in there as well. So lots of different factors. And I think, yes, some of it can be resiliency and doing work to understand, how did these things affect me? How do I want to carry this forward to my own children
yeah.
or not? right?
I have so many questions and they're all just like piling up in my brain. And before I get to the one where I ask about codependency, just gonna pin that. And now, dang it. Oh, no, I know it's come back to me now. What is the difference between like a personality disorder, like narcissism, and something like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia? Or
Interesting.
those types of mental illnesses.
Right. Yeah. So personality disorders are very different from a lot of other mental health diagnoses because they're considered a pervasive pattern that goes, it goes throughout a lifetime. And so it's traits that we might think of in terms of empathy or, kindness, selfishness, things like that. But it's not just in certain scenarios and situations. These are pervasive. And so they show up in almost every area from the time someone becomes an adult, really until the time, that they die, unless they do really, really deep work on it. And that's why it's so hard to treat some personality disorders, because it's pervasive. And like with narcissistic personality disorder, like I was saying earlier, a lot of times they aren't necessarily experiencing the pain of these, pain in themselves as far as these relationships, that they might just keep moving from one person to another and not really experience the pain of it. So different personality disorders would experience different types of pain, like borderline personality disorder.
So,
They're
and is
just
this
different.
something that they can treat with like mood stabilizers or antidepressants?
That doesn't treat it. Sometimes medications are prescribed to help with some of the side effects of some of these different things or some of the symptoms of them, but it doesn't treat the actual personality disorder. That's some pretty deep work for a long period of time to recognize those patterns.
So it sounds like it's really almost impossible to treat.
I wouldn't say impossible. It depends on the type of personality disorder. Some are more easily treated than others, but with narcissistic personality disorder, especially in my experience, it can be incredibly difficult to treat. Number one, probably the biggest difficulty is getting them into treatment. And number two, why do they want to be there? Do they really want to be there working on this?
Right. Maybe they're being dragged in there by a spouse or something. Yeah.
Yes.
So we talked a little bit about the effects of, subpar, not ideal parenting as a child, resulting in something like a personality disorder. So when there's a couple in a narcissistic kind of relationship, there's a narcissist, and usually the other party has some degree of codependency that keeps them in this relationships and keeps them in this bond. And presumably someone who has that kind of codependency that really attracts a narcissist might have some past relationship with a parent that is being played out somehow in this relationship with a narcissist. Because when you think about like how a narcissist treats somebody, I mean, anyone who's, just hearing this would be like, that sounds terrible. Why would anybody be in a relationship like that? Why wouldn't they just run? Who wants to be gaslit? Who wants to be treated like crap? But that's, but the fact of the matter is, if you're in a relationship with one, chances are it's really, really hard to disentangle yourself from that. And you're playing a part in that relationship. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Certainly. Yeah. So in my experience, not necessarily just codependency, but there can be some other characteristics of the partner of the narcissist, which, even having a lot of empathy to the point where narcissists really love a person who has a lot of empathy, because sometimes they will kind of subvert their own needs in order to be there for other people. And so a narcissist really loves that. And so just recognizing one of the things that a narcissistic person will do in general in the beginning is called love bombing. And so kind of learning a lot about that person in the beginning and showering them with a lot of attention and a lot of promises and wonderful things, showing up as your ideal partner, your, you know,
Yeah.
answer to everything, and kind of get that person hooked and thinking, wow, this person is great. This person is amazing. I want more of this.
Mhm.
And then kind of get that person hooked in, so to speak, learn a lot about their, their negatives, their vulnerabilities, the things that they can use later on when it starts becoming more of that narcissistic abuse. And so, and a lot of times people don't understand it. We're getting a lot more press about it these days than we used to, but this has largely been misunderstood for a long time. And it
Yeah.
hasn't really been classified as abuse. So now that we're
Mhm.
learning about emotional abuse and gaslighting and mental abuse and some of the different tactics that they use, now where people are able to understand what's happening.
Yeah, because
Get out.
I think a lot of times people who are in this kind of relationship have a different experience with their partner at home than they do in
Yes.
public. And so, in public, the narcissist may be like the life of the party and super charming and have all the, just
Mhm.
expansive and knows everything and is, awesome to talk to. And then at home is, withholding or, trying to make the other person feel guilty or gaslighting them or just demanding or giving them the silent treatment or any number of other things. And then when you go out, this, the other party goes out and says, he just treats me like crap. People are like, what do you mean? He's awesome. He's a delight. I don't what and I think that I've seen, I have seen lots of cases where the people just aren't believed. And then that just sort of, I would imagine, really compounds your feeling of like, hold on, wait a minute. It must be
Mhm.
me. There must be something really wrong with me because no one else is seeing this and I must be imagining it. And then that increases their desire to do better, right? And to,
Mhm.
work harder. And
Yes.
so so when you have clients, obviously you can't talk about, obviously, I don't even know why I'm saying that. You can't talk about specific people, but I mean, in general terms, um, when people come to you who are suffering from this, do they always see it, or is it something that they're not even aware of, or are they aware of it and they're trying to figure out how to deal with it?
That's a great question. And what you explained in terms of the charm side when people are in public is so, so spot on. So I'll get into that a little bit too, and just my
Mm,
experiences with that. But a lot of times when I get people in, and this is people of all genders, when they're wanting to work on something like this, they often can't pinpoint what it is. They're often just feeling, like my relationship is really causing me a lot of pain. I really don't understand what's happening. And
mhm,
when they start explaining some of the things that are happening, that's when, I do some sort of detective work to try to figure out some of the other parts of it and have them give me examples. And then we, you know, talk a little bit more about all of the different sides of it and how to identify it and how to cope with it, how to put some boundaries or leave, because boundaries
mhm.
don't work very well in this type of relationship. So,
Yeah. So, so when you're working with someone comes in and says, my relationship isn't quite right, and here are some examples of how it makes me feel uncomfortable. And in your mind, you're like, ding, ding, ding.
mhm.
How do you deal with that? Do you just sort of guide them to understand that? Or are you just like flat out like, oh, that's a narcissist right there. You got some problems. I mean, obviously you don't do that, but I
Right.
mean, how much of the way that you handle it is just sort of asking probing questions and
Mhm.
getting curious about it, and how much of it is like um, sort of telling them out, straight
Mhm.
out, or saying you need to go research this.
Right. So a lot of times I ask probing questions to try to make sure that that's what's happening. And so I won't always say that is definitely narcissistic abuse. What I will say, whether it's working with an individual or a couple, if I see it happening in couples counseling, I'll say that right there, that is a type of abuse. that is, just letting you know. And I'm very compassionate and warm about it when I see that happening. But I also want people to recognize that that's abuse.
Yeah.
And so with the individuals, I'll point out that right there. Let's say that it's isolation from someone's
hmm
family and friends, which is a common thing that shows up in narcissistic abuse. I'll say that's isolation and control, and using that to get you away from your people. And that kind of keeps you off balance and makes it harder to leave and harder to say that this is what's happening. Kind of
Yeah.
like you mentioned earlier, that what people are seeing in public, and then if they go home and this is occurring in private, the gaslighting or some of these other tactics, people really doubt themselves. And if they're also isolated from their support system, it's really hard to leave.
Yeah. Yeah. I would imagine it's also really hard to leave if you have kids, or if you're worried about your finances, or you're worried about your safety, whether it's your physical safety or your emotional safety or your kids, you know, safety. I am aware that sometimes when there's this dynamic in the house, and you want to protect your kids from that, it's probably pretty difficult to find ways of navigating that that feel safe for you, safe for your kids, um, and yeah, and just how. So I guess what I'm just babbling now, but what happens when somebody comes in? Just say someone who's been married, who's got kids, somebody who's like dawning on them, like, oh, this is bad. He's not going to change. It's up to me. I'm going to have to make all the decisions. I'm not sure what I want to do yet. I should probably leave. I'm not ready to yet. I'm too afraid. What are some things that you do to work with her to help her get clarity on her situation, to set up boundaries that feel real, but that don't feel so scary that they're constantly worried about, igniting a, explosion that could be damaging, emotionally?
Right. Well, so one thing I want to point out just moving forward is I will also work with men who are partners of narcissistic personality disorder
Mm-hmm.
women, and all
Mm-hmm.
genders. So just sort of putting that out there, I think the first thing is just identifying this is a tactic that's used, this is not healthy, and just being able to label that. Okay, so if somebody
Mm-hmm.
says it really upsets me when he or she gaslights me. Usually they don't have the term yet, gaslight. They haven't gotten to that point yet. They just feel kind of like they're crazy. Like, I know this thing happened, and yet my partner is saying that this other thing happened. But I feel crazy. What's going on here? And so we'll just identify this is gaslighting, and this is a tactic used by someone, in an abusive sense, that's trying to make you doubt your own reality. So number one, just identifying what that is. And
Mm-hmm.
then identifying all of the different tactics that go along with abusive behaviors, like controlling and isolation, financial abuse, using the kids. I mean, there are so many. I could spend a lot of time on that, but really just identifying what those are, so that they, number one, don't feel like they're crazy and they're not
Mm-hmm.
imagining it.
Yeah.
So that's probably the biggest chunk of it, so that they can recognize it and then say, that's abusive. That is, this is not okay. This isn't a healthy, loving way to treat me as your partner.
Yeah. And so, yeah, that kind of goes to the next phase. Once somebody is like, okay, I got it. This is this, and that's gaslighting and all that. What do they do from there? Like if they were like, I don't want to live like that. I want to be able to set some boundaries around myself so I feel a little bit safer. Or is it
Yeah.
different with each partner or each person who comes in?
Well, a lot of it has to do with how many, do you have children together? Do you have a home together? All of these other complicating factors, like you and I discuss when we're doing second Saturday workshops, a lot of this comes down to, is there a power imbalance? And if there's a power imbalance and we have children together, we have a house together, a lot of times you need somebody in your corner that's able to help, legally. So a lot of times
Yeah.
I suggest attorneys and I definitely suggest, mediators for people that are able to go through this in a healthy adult way. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, with a lot of these types of relationships, it's people really need the law on their side and somebody that can
Mhm.
advocate for them legally.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That power dynamic is something that I see a lot. And you're right. If you've got a couple coming in and it's clear that one person is, way up here in terms of power in the relationship, and the other person is way down here, especially if they don't have attorneys.
Hmm.
It's really not a good model for sorting things out. One of the things, one of the things that I like to do when I'm working with people is just try to help them have conversations.
Hmm.
And sometimes that's a place to start, is just like identifying ways to communicate that are, not going to be triggery, that take your thoughts and your projections about what the other person is trying to do or you did before, or whatever, takes that out of the equation, and just really simplifies it to like a piece of information, maybe a request, and just sort of leaving it there. What are some other ways that people who are in a narcissistic relationship can kind of prevent getting pulled into like well, why did you even say that? You did that, and blah, 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 and this and that. And all of a sudden, before you know it, you're in this like whirlwind of arguing word salad that has nothing to do with, can you pick the kids up at 3 or whatever?
Yes, absolutely. That is such a good question. And it's more difficult to do. Obviously, that's a tough thing, but a lot of it is disengaging, just
Mhm.
recognizing it and disengaging, and, having kind of a quick, like a phrase that you use to respond to that instead of getting caught up in it. Because
Mhm.
so just as an example, if someone meets you and they learn all of your deep dark secrets and your vulnerabilities, and they use those every time you get into an argument, if you try to have some sort of boundary, you're going to get, here's what we do to hook you in, and say, yeah, well, you're a, piece of crap, blah, 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 and this and that. Remember you did this and that, and I'm going to embarrass you, and threats and all kinds of things. And there's no way to engage with that in a way that's going to get you anywhere.
Yeah, it's
So
just a
just,
waste of
yeah, recognizing that it's not
energy.
going to work, disengaging from it, walking away, which is very hard to do. That person might keep coming back. If that person is somewhere else, they might keep coming back to where you are and saying, yeah, and this and that, and I'm going to take you to court, and I'm going to do this and that. And I mean, it can just go on
Yeah,
for hours, days.
yeah, yeah,
Really feel
yeah,
for people.
yeah. It's awful. So when we've mainly me have been talking about like the male female dynamic of narcissism, husband and wife or partners. But obviously this dynamic plays out in other ways in families, and in particular with parents and children.
Hmm.
And so I'm wondering how much of that you see, and do you see that play out differently than it does between like romantic partners?
Well, I think talk about power imbalance, boy, when it comes
Mm,
to a parent, if a parent is a narcissist, in the full sense of a personality disorder, boy, talk about a power imbalance. That's a
mm,
pretty intense one. And so a lot of times, especially children, as children develop, they don't understand that the narcissistic parent's view of them is not accurate.
mhm.
They begin to view themselves the way the narcissistic parent does, and so, boy, that does a lot of damage, and if
Yeah,
this parent is unable to empathize and have healthy interactions with them, that does quite a bit of damage.
yeah, yeah. And I would imagine if you have, the same sort of scenario where the narcissist is very charming on the outside and appears to be like really have their stuff together and a good parent, at the PTA meeting or the school ground, and then comes home and is like, what, whatever they might say to their poor child, that would even I mean, that would have even like, that would just compound the negative effects, right? Of a child being like, what is wrong? Why? Where there's this
Hmm.
huge disconnect, but children don't even know how to verbalize that. So what are
Right.
some of the, what are some of the effects, like long-term effects on kids who have suffered that and as adults, and how, you know, assuming that they've moved out of home and, you know, they're in a relationship, you know, that's not the subject of this conversation right now. Are there ways that you can help them just sort of understand and protect themselves, and start to like really know that it wasn't them?
Hmm. Yes.
I mean,
So
imagine
very,
that's really a lot of work.
yes. And I think, again, number one is identifying that, because people, especially children, boy, so much of this is turned back on the children instead of the parents taking responsibility and saying, oh, that's my fault that I just, I'm trying to think of an example, but instead of taking responsibility and saying, I just yelled at you and screamed at you and demeaned you and belittled you, and I'm so sorry, that's on me. It's not about you. You didn't do anything to deserve this. It's just, that's just kind of the norm. And so children of a narcissistic parent kind of internalize all of those things and believe that that's who they are, that those tactics that are used to belittle them, that's how they are truly as people. And so it's a lot of work just identifying what has happened and identifying that, no, you're not that person, that it's
Yeah.
healthy to have your own needs, that you're not there just to provide a status symbol for your parent or to make your parent look good in all of these different ways, that you have your own needs too. And you can say no, you can distance, use
Hmm.
some different, or even not even have a relationship with that parent if it's to that level.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what about relationships where it is the woman who's the narcissist in a relationship with the man? Does that play out differently, or is it pretty much the same thing?
To me, I think it plays out a little differently in terms of, I think a lot of people are hesitant to believe that women can be narcissists as well.
Hmm.
Just because of cultural beliefs and norms. And boy, I think people really hesitate to believe that. So talk about if a man or another woman has been in a relationship with a female narcissist, number one, there's that doubt anyway, that that's
Yeah.
actually happening because of the charm side that's shown in public. But number two, a lot of times people say, well, that's, women are not like that. She's great, she's wonderful, she's caring, she's just powerful, she's not,
Hmm.
right, she's not a narcissist. And so people really doubt that. And I think for men in particular that are experiencing that kind of abuse, there's so much shame wrapped around it, because they
Mm.
feel like, how come I'm not tough enough to be able to deal with this? And
Yeah.
it's this crazy life behind closed doors that is affecting them just in the same way, just as intensely.
Yeah. So there are a couple of different categories of narcissists, right? There's a covert narcissist and a
Over.
overt and or manipulative. Is that what it's called? Manipulative narcissist. Um, so that I was just thinking that as you were talking about a woman narcissist, I could imagine if if she is of the covert type, it would be even more difficult because,
Mhm.
you know, that the qualities of that tend to be like more internalized and have to do a lot with trying to garner sympathy from other people. And do you want, can you talk a little bit about those two different types?
Yes. So overt is really just like it sounds. So it's something that's a little bit more in your face that you can see. Covert kind of is happening more on the down low, kind of behind the scenes. And so when it comes to covert narcissism, something interesting with the gender dynamic is when people have a mother who is narcissistic, that is quite a challenge, because
It's like a
people think,
double
oh,
whammy. Yeah.
right. People think, oh, well, mothers are nurturing and giving and loving and, able to kind of intuit what your needs are. And that's sometimes narcissistic mothers are able to use those cultural stereotypes and use those to manipulate their children, manipulate other people to believe that they are providing that, and then they wait till they get home and play that out with the children.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty upsetting power dynamic in that sense.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, how much do you see this in your practice, and have you seen more lately, or has it just become more okay to talk about, or is it just kind of basically the same?
That's an interesting question because I only have my own experience with my own clients. But since I do tend to work with people on all different parts of relationship spectrum, you know, in terms of relationships, breakups, divorce, all of that, I see it pretty frequently in different levels of it, you know, and you can look at overt and covert in terms of different levels on that spectrum. Sometimes it is incredibly insidious and overt and really scary. And sometimes it's more of that covert type that has its own challenges, certainly. But I see it very regularly. And so I don't know if it's increasing or if it's just that now we have a term for it and people are coming forward. There are a lot more books and resources and, you know, web pages and Facebook things and all kinds of great resources. So I do get more people that are actually aware of it and say, I think this is what I'm dealing with. But yes, I work with it every day.
Yeah. And so, oh God, I had such a good question. It's just gone. Oh, now it's back. So when you are working with people in different stages of their relationship, whether they're men or women, do you work with them differently if they're in a relationship and they're like, I'm miserable, but I'm too afraid to leave. I can't leave. And versus someone who's like, I'm in it and I'm ready to leave and now I'm just afraid. So I need to get out. Do you change the way that you support them?
In terms of someone early on, just kind of noticing what's happening versus someone in the end?
Yeah. I mean, or just like really, really understanding, but not ready to leave, or understanding it and ready to leave.
Right. Yeah, and that is definitely a possibility. People that I work with very regularly, it's especially with children and a home that they share and, you know, a name, a reputation to protect all of those things, it is a lot harder for people to leave. And so with that, it's just continuing to support people and educate on, okay, yep, there's another example of that type of abuse. And it's just teaching people to trust that when they're ready, they'll make that call.
And have you seen, and have you seen very many cases of someone who's like, I'm in this relationship, I don't want to be in it, but I'm scared, who just never leave? Or do they just leave your practice and you just don't follow, or you don't, have continued connection with them and you don't know what happened? Or
yeah, in a lot of cases, people do end up leaving. And part of our work together is trying to figure out, okay, what is this going to look like? Because unfortunately, especially with children involved or some sort of shared asset, the narcissistic abuse doesn't stop when the romantic relationship is over. A lot of times it transfers into, you know, parental alienation and things regarding the children. And it's really
makes
tough to see
a
that.
divorce messy, huh?
Yeah, it does. And so, and, you know, given that staying in that is not good for that individual. So just kind of recognizing how can you work with this person? We often suggest parallel parenting in cases of really extreme narcissistic abuse, which is we kind of do our own things as parents instead of co-parenting because there's just too much abuse happening in that co-parenting type relationship.
Yeah.
So that's something that gets confused commonly.
Sure. So we don't have too much time left, but if you have advice, if anybody is watching this who's going through that, do you have any last parting advice for helping them and wherever they are?
Yes, I think number one is it's education. Learn about this and understand what this involves so that you don't feel crazy, so that you can recognize what's actually happening. There's some really great authors. Shahida Arabi is amazing. She wrote a book called Power, Surviving and Thriving After Narcissistic Abuse. And she has a really incredible Facebook. I don't think it's a group, but she posts a lot of really great things, has written several books. There are lots of good resources out there. You Can Thrive After Narcissistic Abuse. That's Melanie, Tanya Evans. There's some great people. And so just do some research. Feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to support you through this. Really just make sure that you're not alone going through this. You need support and advocacy.
Yeah, I think that's huge. So when we're done recording here, I'm going to ask you to send me links to these things, and I'll put them somehow. I still haven't figured this whole thing out yet, but I'll put them in there so that if people want to research those authors and those resources and they'll just be able to click on it pretty easily. And if someone does want to reach you, how's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so my website has a contact page, and it's just Jen Meyer, MEYER, counseling.com. I'd love to hear from you. That's probably the easiest way to get in touch with me. I also have a Facebook page, Jennifer Meyer Counseling LLC. So I'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much for having me on, Liz. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I really love this conversation, and I loved getting to know you a little bit better. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.